archaeologists. Deaver recently wrote, "Has Archaeology Buried the Bible?" where he reflects on the failure of a secular agenda for biblical archaeology, while also providing a model for the value of archaeology to biblical studies. Recently at a symposium at Lipscomb University, Deaver stated that the future of biblical archaeology is at Lipscomb. And I agree with him also on that. Bill Deaver is the leading scholar in the field of Near Eastern and biblical archaeology. He was professor of Near Eastern Studies and Anthropology at the University of Arizona from 1975 to 2002. And this is where my colleague, Dr. Davis, attended. And then I'm the younger one, so 10 years later, I was also one of Bill Deaver's students. He is currently a distinguished professor of Near Eastern archaeology at Lycoming College in Pennsylvania. I can tell you a lot of stories about Bill Deaver, but I just want to read some of his books. Recent Archaeological Discoveries in Biblical Research. What did the biblical writers know and when did they know it? What archaeology can tell us about the reality of ancient Israel? Who were the early Israelites and where did they come from? A provocative book, Did God Have a Wife? Archaeology and Folk Religion in Ancient Israel. The Lives of Ordinary People in Ancient Israel. And then his magnus opum, Beyond the Biblical Text. And then his latest one has Archaeology Buried the Bible. And then his memoir, My 9 Lives. When he came to Lipscomb last year, he got so energized, he wrote another book. And so he already has a manuscript. Now, there are a lot of scholars that write a lot of books, but what you don't know is Dr. Deaver is 90 years old, and he's still writing. Part of this symposium was to celebrate his life's work and to honor him, and most of these colleagues came from around the world to honor him this event. And so without further ado, I want to tell you that we have one of the top archaeologists here and an influential man. So Dr. Deaver, without further ado, please come up.
Does archaeology have a future? Biblical archaeology? For 2 days now, we've been debating that question with scholars from all over the world. I wish I could convey to you the excitement of those papers. And the answer to the question is yes. And at this point, I want to thank Tom Davis and Steve Ortiz, the organizers of this symposium. My students, I'm proud to say. Somebody said to me once, what about your students? I said, I'm so proud of my students, and to get a job for them, I would kill for them. And they said, you have. And I'm here to support them in part. And in particular, I want to thank Mark Lanier, without whom we would not be here, and without whom the Lanier Center for Archaeology would not exist at Lipscomb, and all of you students wouldn't be here either. He is, I think, a messenger with a message sent from heaven. So this is about the future. What am I doing here, an old man? Well, what are my credentials? My father was a country preacher in the United Church, in the Church of Christ, and I grew up in small towns in the South and the Midwest. And if you think I have a big voice, you should have heard my father. So I grew up in the world of the Bible, and I can still hear the cadence of biblical language in the King James, of course, in my ears. So I know where you are because I have been there. So I want to tell you a story, trying to simplify some of the things that we discussed in the symposium here. I want to begin in the 19th century with the rediscovery of the long-lost lands of the Bible and the beginnings of biblical archaeology. And I want to remind you that from the very beginning, the rediscovery of the lands of the Bible and what came to be known as biblical archaeology was all about the Bible. Let me quote from a few observers of the scene. Here is a quote from James Orr in The Problem of the Old Testament. Notice, with the discovery of modern critical methods and modernism, archaeology was seen as the defense against all of this. So Orr said, "It must be accounted a wonderful providence of God that at a time when so much is being said and done to discredit the Old Testament, so marvelous a series of discoveries bearing directly on matters contained in its pages should be made. A new claimant to be heard has put in its voice in the science of archaeology, which bids fair before long to control both criticism and history." And some years later, Newton, in a book edited by Prescott in 1933, "The Spade and the Bible, Archaeological Discoveries Support the Old Book." Not a ruined city has been opened up that has given any comfort to unbelieving critics or evolutionists. Every find of archaeologists in biblical lands has gone to confirm Scripture and to confound its enemies. Not since Christ ascended back to heaven have there been so many scientific proofs that God's Word is true. Amen. Well, it's easy to smile, but that was the optimism in the 19th century. Later on, Albright, the great father of the discipline, coined the term revolution. Archaeology will revolutionize our understanding of the Bible, and so it has, but not in the way that he thought. In 1893, there was launched a periodical called The Biblical World, and one of the authors, thinking of archaeology still in its infancy, said, "How long must we wait?" Well, in 1890, Sir Flinders Petrie, really the father of Palestinian archaeology, began digging at Tel el-Hesi in southern Palestine. And 3 years later, the Americans weren't waiting. The first real archaeologist and the first real excavation by Frederick J. Bliss. Almost forgotten today, unfortunately. Now let's look ahead a bit. William Foxwell Albright, whose name you know very well, is often thought of as the father of biblical archaeology. He was born in 1890 and came to Palestine in his early 20s, thinking everything would already be dug up. There wouldn't be anything left for him. But within an incredibly short time, he mastered all that was then known and moved far beyond that. Albright was a genius. There's no way to describe his work. But years later, in a symposium entitled "What Remains of the House That Albright Built?" I argued, not much, except the ruined foundations. All good things come to an end. Well, I have lived long enough to have overlapped with Albright. Not long before his death, I took him to Gezer for a field trip. When I went to get him at the hotel, Mrs. Albright, a little wisp of a lady, said, "If you harm a hair of his head, I will kill you." He didn't have any hair, but she would have killed me. So since I go back all the way to Albright and even earlier, my connection with biblical archaeology goes back almost 100 years. I first went to Israel more than 65 years ago, and my autobiography, 9 Lives, after a recent recovery, I am now in my 10th life and last. Well, what to say? In the 40s and 50s and 60s, especially after the war, Albright founded a whole series of excavations. They were all at biblical sites. The staff was always made up of biblical scholars, most of them clergy. Shechem, where I began, was like that. There were no women on the staff. The women were the wives of the excavators, and they did the housekeeping. That is unimaginable today, unimaginable. But that was the story. Now, the agenda of Albright and his followers is simple. They wanted to really prove the historicity of the patriarchal era. They wanted to talk about Moses and monotheism and the covenant at Sinai, Exodus and conquest, of course, divine kingship. And above all, they wanted to argue that ancient Israel was unique. There had never been anything like it. And this is what we now call Christian triumphalism. Albright's greatest work, or so he thought, was from the Stone Age to Christianity, the culmination of the whole process. Well, today we simply don't think that way. But since I had grown up with the Bible in seminary, I discovered the works of one of Albright's early students, George Ernest Wright. And I decided I wanted to study with Wright. He had, at that time, been both the leading Old Testament theologian in the country and the leading Palestinian archaeologist. He combined both disciplines. Albright had combined archaeology and history, but Wright combined archaeology and theology. So I applied to Harvard. And I was turned down, even though I had graduated with the highest honors from seminary. They thought I was a fundamentalist, not really Harvard material. Well, so I went, and I was admitted after a year of being on trial. But I went to study theology with Ernest, and I realized that this wasn't going to work the way I thought. It was not going to be the revival of Old Testament theology that Ernest talked about. So I went to him and I said, I think I'm meant to be a pastor. I'm going to drop out. Now, Ernest was a Presbyterian clergyman and a devout Christian, as well as a practicing field archaeologist. And he said, well, Frank Cross says you're not much of a Hebraist. You might as well try archaeology. Better come with me to Shechem in 1962. I was in my 20s still. I went. Again in 1964, I went back to Shechem when I'd finished my residence. And after 2 or 3 weeks, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I never looked back. I differed with Ernest, and later I attacked his views in a way that perhaps was not diplomatic. But I owe everything to Ernest. Without him, I wouldn't be here. Into the dig at Shechem in the 3rd week, Ernest took me aside and he said, well, I'm going to be the visiting director of the new American school in West Jerusalem on the Israeli side, and I want you to come with me. And I'm going to start an excavation at Gezer, and of all my students, I want you to be the director. So I spent the year 64, 65 in West Jerusalem at the Hebrew Union College, and during the course of that year, Nelson Glick, the other most famous American biblical archaeologist, asked me to come back to the school and become the director. And so I was to be the director of the excavations at Gezer, the largest project in the country, and also of the new, now named the Nelson Glick School of Biblical Archaeology. So that's how I started, riding on the coattails of 2 gigantic figures. So 4 days after I graduated in 1966, I was in Israel to take up residence, and I stayed 10 years. I became the director first of the American School in West Jerusalem, and then the Old School in East Jerusalem. In 1975, I returned to the U of A, where I spent my whole career. Now, I mounted a revolution in those days, but there's another revolution of which I did not see the full significance, the 1967 war. I was right in the middle of it. Hebrew Union College was on the border of the no man's land. I stood on my balcony and watched the old city fall. But I had no idea where this was going, and I'm still not sure. Now, sitting in Jerusalem after the war, the only American archaeologist resident in Israel or the West Bank or in Jordan, I had a lot of time to think. The directorship of the excavations was over. And so I decided that I needed to think about what we biblical archaeologists had been doing. And I realize now that much of my view was shaped by my residence in Israel. So for me, biblical archaeology was what the Israelis were doing, and they weren't doing what we had been doing. So there was a little magazine called Christian News from Israel, and I decided to write a little article questioning American-style Albrightian and Wrightian biblical archaeology. My wife at the time said, you better not do this. So I said, no, it's a little magazine. It's written for Christians in Israel. Nobody will read it. Well, Wright read it. And he wrote me a letter as a father would write to a prodigal son. And I still have the letter, and I remember the way it ends. Ernest said, "You've got to get right with Albright." I thought it sounded like a toothpaste commercial. Well, I never did. And when I returned to the States in 1975, I now had a new platform and a new sermon to preach. Well, I mounted a revolution. In the beginning, I was alone. I had no idea what I was doing. Had I understood the ruckus it would create, I never would have tried it. So I sat there alone in the library at the Albright Institute, where I was now the director, and I mounted a revolution. Now, my goal as I look back on it was really quite simple. All along, American biblical archaeology had been a subdiscipline of biblical theology, and I wanted to separate the two disciplines. It was not a matter of getting rid of the Bible, but I wanted biblical archaeology to be archaeology. And my goal from the beginning was to create a dialogue between two independent but complementary disciplines. Heretofore, it had all been a monologue. Amateur biblists playing at archaeology, talking to each other. And I thought, that's not professional. It's also not specialized. And so I argued for a new approach to biblical archaeology, and I argued, the watchwords were, it should be professional, it should be specialized, expert, and it should be secular. Well, that's what I was thinking. I wanted to change the name. I wanted to call it Syro-Palestinian archaeology because that's what Albright had called it originally. And I didn't invent the name. I simply tried to revive it. But Syro-Palestinian, not biblical. And from the beginning, it was misunderstood as wanting to get rid of the Bible. I wanted to bring the Bible back to the center, but with a new voice, a clear voice. So how secular that was, I don't know. I think my background still overcame everything. So all this seemed obvious to me. I didn't know that I was starting a revolution. I was incredibly innocent. The only time in my life, by the way. For me, it was amateurish, was biased, and it had failed. Albright's agenda was never achieved. And I even called it for a while a new style of biblical archaeology. Well, I should have known there would be a reaction. I'm not sure Ernest Wright lived long enough to read the little monograph that I published in 1974. It was the Winslow Lectures at Seabury Western Theological Seminary, entitled Biblical Archaeology, Retrospects and prospects. But Ernest got the word, and he was very unhappy about it. Well, when I came home at 41, I realized I was a celebrity before I was even famous. I was into a controversy I had no idea. I was simply doing what I thought was obvious, sitting in Israel in communication with Israelis. Well, several years went by, but in 1978, ASOR had a plenary session, a full session, and a whole series of papers were read, all of them aimed at me. And of course, I was the man who killed biblical archaeology. Well, I'm flattered. I never had that much influence. I simply observed its passing and wrote its obituary. I was the first to do it, but I was no longer alone. Well, those papers weren't published until 1982, and by now the controversy was out in the open, and I was in the middle of it. In 1984, the Israelis organized the first international symposium on biblical archaeology. The keynote speaker was, of course, Yigal Yadin. He spent much of his lecture attacking me. Well, again, I should be flattered. He never named me, but he said a certain young American archaeologist. That was me. Well, so now it was all out in the open. That was in April of 1984. Yadin died in July. I was excavating at Gezer, and I called him and said, look, we have some evidence of a Solomonic gate here, which you wrote about. Come out. He said, I'll be out. He died of a heart attack the next day, and I went to his funeral. Well, that was the end of a long struggle, but the revolution took hold. In 1985, I wrote what was really the obituary of biblical archaeology in a handbook edited by Knight and Tucker called The Hebrew Bible and Its Modern Interpreters. Today, that's regarded as the obituary of the movement. By now, everybody agreed that we had to be doing things in a different way. The Israeli school was maturing now, and we were in an altogether new world. I would like to tell you about the successes of that revolution, but in short, it achieved much of what we had accomplished. By now, modern field work in Israel, done by both Israelis and Americans, was interdisciplinary. It was driven by adequate theories, and above all, the work was beginning to be published. There was an explosion of new knowledge in this era between about 1985 and about 2000. And not only in Israel, but also in surrounding lands. And remember, I wanted to talk about Syro-Palestinian archaeology because I wanted it to expand to the larger world. Today, we're not digging anything but graves in Syria. And Palestine, what can I say? So today, most of us call the field Levantine archaeology. That doesn't mean much to most people. I don't like it, but my own students seem to have helped to invent it. So Levantine archaeology. By now, almost all of us mean by biblical archaeology the dialogue between Levantine or Near Eastern archaeology and biblical studies, and in that sense the term is still used. But I want to tell you something you may not know. The Israelis use the term biblical archaeology, but by that they mean something very different. For them, it's a chronological term. It means the archaeology of the biblical period, the Iron Age from about 1200 to about 600. It has none of the theological baggage that accompanies the American usage. So bear that in mind in talking about biblical archaeology. Well, I have described this in previous papers as the loss of the center. There is a lot of evidence to show that. By the center we mean simply a series of core values that help us to unify what we are doing, that give us a sense of purpose, a sense of mission. And I think we've lost much of that. But the Bible has still been the center of what we're doing one way or another. It has never been a question of whether to use the Bible by anybody with any sense, but only how. And on that question, we still disagree. I think of myself as a secularist, but for me, the rationale is the Western cultural tradition, which until recently was called the Judeo-Christian tradition. And at its center is also the Bible. So I want to talk about reason, about truth, about individual freedom and responsibility, about progress toward a better world. Those are all biblical values, and they're American values as well. So bear in mind, the crisis we're talking about is not a crisis for Israelis. For them, archaeology is part of the history of their land and part of their identity as a people. They have their problems, of course, and I have been kind of critical of Israeli archaeology, but the crisis we face is ours, and it is largely a crisis for secularists like me. I grew up in the modernist fundamentalist controversy. My father always talked about the modernists. I didn't know who they were, but I knew they were the bad guys. Well, I guess I became one of the bad guys, but I didn't mean to. I just want to mention some recent things. 20 years ago, the University of Arizona closed my program, which at the time was the largest program in Near Eastern archaeology in the world. I was given 20 minutes to defend a program it took me 20 years to build before a committee on which there was not a single archaeologist or anthropologist. And the dean told me, well, you know, you're not making any money. And I told her, Madam, I have it on the best of authority that is a not-for-profit institution. 3 days later, I resigned as departmental head, and 2 years later, I retired early. That was the end of my program. We produced 28 PhDs during those years, some of whom are here and among our speakers. The chair at Harvard had been a key position. Ernest Wright died in 1974, and for a long time there was nobody there. But then through a major gift, the Dorot chair was established, and Larry Steger occupied that chair for a number of years. But Larry retired. He died several years ago, and then the Dorot chair has been vacant until just recently, perhaps with a new hire. Eric and Carol Myers had directed a distinguished program all their lives at Duke University in the archaeology of the later periods. Their program was abandoned when they retired, and the chairs, the two endowed chairs they held all their lives, were combined, and the deans associated them with other fields. For me, the most shocking closure was the closure of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Nelson Glick's life dream, a 150-year-old liberal Jewish seminary. It is closing and will never reopen again. The Jerusalem branch of the Cincinnati School, from which I have an honorary doctorate, is also closing in another year. A school I directed. I still am not able to understand this. But then the Tandy Institute was closed. And that was a shock throughout the whole world of biblical archaeology. And it could have been the end of 2 successful careers, except for our angel again, who within hours, literally within hours, was on to this and simply said that he wanted to found a new center at his own alma mater, Lipscomb University, and that he would back Tom and Steve, and they were rescued. And now this is a flourishing center, and I think the center for biblical archaeology, and it would not exist without Mark Lemire. So I think, yes. But the crisis, you see, is the result of the closure of centers and programs, the loss of institutional support, the fact that there are not going to be any jobs, the lack of motivation or justification, and this creates a disciplinary crisis. And the question simply is, does American archaeology in Israel and the lands of the Bible have any longer any hope in the secular liberal tradition, or must there be a new center? So, my answer is, the center can move, and perhaps it has to. Well, that leads me to the question, evangelicals to the rescue? Now, I would like to claim that I foresaw all of this 40 years ago, and that's why I trained some evangelical scholars. I didn't have a clue. They wanted to come and study with me. I told them in the beginning, and you will remember, if you want to do theology, go to a seminary. I always want to say cemetery for some reason. If you want to do archaeology, let's do it here. And you may find this hard to believe, but they will bear me. We never discussed questions of faith. Not because they don't matter, not at all, but because those questions have to be postponed. And I remember telling them, I'm not interested in what you believe, and what I believe is none of your business. Let's do archaeology. And we did. Now, I want to remind you that all along evangelicals had been doing archaeology. The problem is they didn't have much training. They were mostly biblicists. They were mostly clergy. They were amateurs. And the person who really founded American evangelical archaeology with real credentials is sitting right back there, Larry Garrity. He was the first to have a real degree from Harvard. And in the 1960s already, he became the director of the Madaba Plains Project in Jordan, which is still running after nearly 50 years. And it's an evangelical project of Seventh-day Adventists, and it is one of the best projects. I remember once I was asked to review the Adventist work in Jordan, and I said, well, I certainly admire the sober approach with which they are now publishing, I think, their 15th volume, and they have spun off a whole series of projects in Jordan, which is not even quite the heart of the Holy Land, and they have sold it to their constituents. It's a fantastic project, and one of which evangelicals should be proud. Now, Adventists have also worked in Jordan and Israel as well, and Michael Hazel, who's here, one of our speakers, one of my students, has been co-directing several projects in Israel, and has just helped to produce the new evidence for the fact that there was a Solomonic kingdom and even a Davidic kingdom. And you probably know his popular works, and he will be publishing again soon. And at Gezer, my own site, Steve has gone back to excavate almost 10 years, and he also has produced a series of radiocarbon-14 dates that nail down the 10th century. So the supporters of the low chronology have been, laid to rest. The conventional chronology is a triumph of scholarship, not of evangelical archaeology, not of secular archaeology, just of good archaeology. And that's what we should have been doing. So I want to bring. Tom Davis has excavated not only in Jordan, but in Cyprus, and for a long time was the director of our American school in Cyprus. And I'm proud of his record as well. Bob Mullins from Azusa Pacific is co-director at Tel Abel Bet Ma'akah. Dan Master from Wheaton College is co-director of the excavations at Tel Shimron. So there is already a long tradition of evangelical archaeology, but this time it is not amateur, it's professional. And that makes all the difference. And as far as the biblical bias, believe me, I would recognize it, and I don't see it. I don't see it. Here's a thing that I find ironic. In Israel, the fundamentalists, the orthodox, the Haredim, the God-fearers, hate archaeology and archaeologists. They break into archaeological sites. They desecrated the grave of Yadin. In America, our fundamentalists love archaeology because they think it's going to prove their view of the Bible. Interesting. Well, I'm arguing that the center can move and a new center can be found, and it must be found. So the question is, can evangelicals fill the vacuum that is created by my secular approach and the approach of a number of others, which I think is fading? And it pains me to criticize my own work. But we have to learn. We have to learn. We can't just go on doing business as usual. We must find a new justification for archaeology in Israel and in the biblical lands. Well, can evangelicals do it? I wouldn't be here if I didn't think so. But I have some advice from somebody who's been around a rather long time. Don't be fundamentalists. I used to see a bumper sticker in Tucson, and it said, "God said it, I believe it, and that settles it." This was usually on the back of a pickup truck with a rifle rack in the rear mirror, and you don't argue with those folks. There is no such thing as fundamentalist scholarship because the fundamental is missing, which is an open mind. But evangelicals, staunch believers, can be first-rate critical scholars. And that's the point. Do it the right way. I think also you have to choose your battles. You can't win the war, but you can win some battles. Give up the biblical patriarchs. There's no evidence. We know probably as much as we're going to know. Stick to things where you have a chance of making a contribution. Don't try to compete with the Israelis. It's their field. It's their country. And rightly so. They are so far ahead of us that we barely can make a contribution. When I began, we Americans were almost on an equal par because we were all trying to learn together. But now the Israelis are doing fantastic field work. They are publishing, and they're publishing in English, not only serious scholarly works, but popular works as well. So we have to play a drastically reduced role, but there is still room for us, and the Israelis welcome us, but only as long as we're professional and have real credentials. And evangelicals must create new jobs for those you lost and brand new positions at your own institutions. You have to publish. Don't just publish in your own magazines. You're preaching to the choir. You publish in mainstream journals. Show what you can do. And create new institutions if you have to, new publication series. And try, if possible, to become mainstream, no longer peripheral. Well, that's a long list of things to do and not to do. The real question is, why should archaeology in Israel survive? Why should we Americans of any persuasion be involved? It's not our business, is it? Well, it has been. And for many Americans, not only Christians and Jews, but many secularists in America, this is still the Holy Land. And it is still the land of the Bible, and the Bible is still at the heart of American life, although often misunderstood, I think. So archaeology can contribute, and it can contribute a lot. First of all, archaeology helps us to look at the Bible from an external point of view, evidence outside the Bible that can help us to understand the world in which the Bible was written and first read and understood. So it's all about context, the world of the Bible, which until modern archaeology we had scarcely any chance of understanding. This you may find hard to believe, but recently I was asked to explain what has changed in archaeology in 60 years since you graduated. And I thought about it, and I think we know at least 20 times what we knew when I was a graduate student. Is that progress? Yes, yes. And you will know so much more if we have a chance. If we have a chance. So we don't need to prove the Bible. We need to understand how those who first experienced these events thought about it and what it meant to them and can mean now to us. There's a wonderful verse in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2. For all those who sleep in the dust. All those anonymous folk in ancient Israel who were forgotten, who left no record, the people without a history. Archaeology brings them back to life and allows them to speak to us in our time, but only if we understand the world in which the Bible itself first came to life. So I want to argue that archaeology can be helpful. It can give you a kind of historical basis. It makes faith not seem foolishness, but somehow rational, true in our experience. And that's an enormous help. And I want to give you a quick, simple example of what archaeology can and cannot do. I began to excavate the Field 3 palace and city wall and the gates at Gezer. And we brought to light some elements. The gate itself and the city walls we wanted to date to the 10th century, the time of Solomon. But that was before C14 dating. So many years later, Steve and his team go back and for another 10 years and complete the excavation of the palace, the administrative building next to the gate, did more work with the walls and the gate itself. And now, just in the last month, Steve has published with his colleagues a brilliant article illustrating that the dates now achieved by C14 dating are around 975 to 925, exactly the dates of the reign of Solomon, fixed by Egyptian astronomical chronology. And so I consider that the end of 30 years of distraction by skeptics, a great victory for biblical archaeology and important. And Barr will soon publish the news of that. So you can go to Gezer and you can walk through the street of the gate where Solomon probably walked on dedication day when he came out to have a look. It's still there. It's still there. And the foundations are less than a centimeter out of plumb after 3,000. A magnificent piece of work that only a king could have done, who could command men and material. So the gate is there, and I think we can now call it what I always did, the Solomonic gate. So, but here is the point. Archaeology can show that there was a king named Solomon. He really did build some magnificent things, including the gates and the city walls at Gezer. And in that sense, the biblical writers got it right. The story is true. Here is the point. Think of the rest of the story. Solomon is said to have had 1,000 wives and assistant wives. 2 is a lot. And it is said that he collected 484 pounds of gold in tribute every year. That's a lot. He ruled a kingdom from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates. All the kings of the earth came to see him. He imported 120,000 workers from Hiram, king of Tyre. The whole population wasn't 120,000. Now, most of you are sensible enough to know that that's a tall tale. You don't have to believe it, and you shouldn't. But the point is, for the biblical writers, it was all miraculous. So archaeology can tell you, yes, it happened pretty much in that way. But the notion that this was all miraculous due to the fact that he was a divinely appointed king is a theological conclusion, and you may or may not agree, but archaeology isn't going to help you. You have to make up your own mind. You could you could consult your clergy person. I don't know that would help. It depends on the clergy person. But that's what archaeology can and cannot do. Remember this, the Bible is not history in anything like the modern sense, and it doesn't purport to be. Did you know that in the Hebrew Bible there is no word for history? There's no word. It's a collection of stories. I used to tell my undergraduate students, the Bible is not history, it's his story, the story of God and his dealings with his people. So don't try to make the Bible something it doesn't want to be. Archaeology is an important help in creating faith and an identity of faith, but it is not necessary. Archaeology cannot prove the truth of the Bible in that sense, but neither can it disprove it either. So I hope you will approach it that way. Now, if you will tolerate a short sermon by a heretic, I want to talk to you about faith. We haven't talked a lot about that, but it's been in the back of all of our minds here, I think. In short, what can one believe, and how does archaeology help? Archaeology, simply put, is trying to understand or imagine what it might have been like to have been there, to have lived then in the world in which the Bible was written and first read. What was it really like? And that's what archaeology can help us to do. But I want to remind you, if I may, of Galatians chapter 2, verse 16. Paul says, and I'm quoting in a modern translation, a person is justified not by works of the law, but through faith. Not even good works. And archaeology is very good work. That's not the point. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, again, quoting, by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God. Faith. And read Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, and then follows a long list, finally down to the time of David, by faith. Now, I want to suggest to you that faith, in the biblical sense, is the willingness to risk your life on the possibility that the biblical writers were correct in their interpretation of the meaning of things. Faith is not knowledge, it is not certitude, it is risk. The willingness to be wrong and to change your mind. Now, we shall never know all we want to know. We know a lot more than we did once, but in the end, there may be no certain knowledge of anything. But my point is, you know enough of the truth to act on what you know. In the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, faith doesn't mean some theoretical proposition. It's not intellectual, not even emotional. Faith is faithfulness. Faith means keeping the covenant. It means acting. It means doing the truth that you know. And I want to argue that faith must be modest, it must be humble, it must be open-minded, it must be willing to learn, willing to listen to others who see it differently. Faith is not belligerent. It doesn't go to war. It is the willingness to live with what we have. And as I think of the violence engulfing the Middle East, faith is all we have left. Faith is hope. And I remind you of Hebrews chapter 11. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The past is not fully seen, and it never will be. But again, we know enough. And this is no time to abandon your faith. It is time to renew it. And you will understand if I say, Godspeed.
I want to thank sincerely the good professor for walking through 90 years of history for us in a very abbreviated yet very informative way. And so thank you. If you've got questions, we will do a Q&A with him shortly. While you are writing out any questions you may have, they'll be collected if you'll pass them to the center of the aisle. I'll tell you three things while we wait. First of all, David Fleming has already told you about the lectures upcoming. They're going to be quite good. And so I'm excited, and I hope that you will be back. Number two, I want to say thank you to the student scholars who have come all the way here from Nashville. And thank you very much. I also want to say thank you to all of the other scholars. We've got some incredible people in the room. Larry Garrity has already been pointed out from California, who's another one who has been in this for a long time. But I've got my friend Tim Harrison, who's been to the library before but hadn't been here in a long time, who's now in Chicago, and it is great to have him and so many others. James Hoffmeyer, who has given us lectures on Egyptology and done so well, and countless others as well. So thank you to all of the scholars that are here. I am honored to get to serve on the board of Azor and also on the Albright board. And I know that we've got Jody Magnus and a number of others, Andy Vaughn, who are here from those boards and other places. And so you've got a lot of people to meet, and it's just a delight to have them here. Last but not least, as I'm getting ready, we've got one question, so get your sharp wits about you. Those of you who don't have any place to be in the morning, at 9:30 in the morning, Champion Forest Baptist Church, I will be teaching my third class in a series I'm teaching this spring on the book of Revelation. And I would urge you to come. You might enjoy it. You might not, but it's part of a type of literature, apocalyptic literature, that the Dead Sea Scrolls have given us a lot of information on. Not quite, sort of, archaeology. Close enough. All right. Are you ready for some questions? If we've got any more, would you rather sit down? You've been standing.
No, I won't be able to get back up.
Oh, that's fair. All right. I've got several, including this one, but I've got a couple of my own. And so I'm starting with one of mine. I found it intriguing that you've spent a career separating out theology from archaeology, and then you gave us a lecture that had both.
I separated it to put it back.
Totally fair. Absolutely. Sometimes you just got to take something apart to see how it goes
Exactly.
together. There's no question about that. You've spoken about ancient Near Eastern developments. What do you consider the status of New Testament biblical archaeology, if any?
Well, Jody Magnus, one of our speakers, gave a brilliant lecture showing why biblical archaeology was mostly Old Testament archaeology. Most of the practitioners were Old Testament clergy and Old Testament professors. And there are reasons, maybe not good reasons, but that, for the most part, biblical archaeology has been and mostly an affair of Protestant scholarship. And again, there are reasons for that. Things develop not necessarily in the way that we think they ought to. And one of the things we need to do is to do more New Testament archaeology, which you're doing with Tom Davis already at the Lipscomb Center. And we need to do more of that. We need new programs elsewhere at other evangelical institutions. After all, isn't the New Testament at the heart of Christianity?
Yeah, it's pretty up there. And we also have here Stephen Notley. Stephen, where are you? Stephen's been digging, wave your arm. Stephen's been digging at Bethsaida and has found, finally, we've found Bethsaida. There's not really, he's hadn't quite found a road sign that says Bethsaida was here, but it's pretty close. Very good. So there is some other aspects of this that will be fascinating. Okay, was there an observation you made in your younger years that you changed as your knowledge matured?
Oh, I changed a great deal of my ideas. I look back at the learned papers I wrote in the seminary. I'm glad none of them were published. And over the years, I have changed my mind many times about many things. For a long time, I was very confident about my work and about the revolution. I'm not so confident any longer. One of the things that helped me here was to learn that maybe it wasn't all for nothing. You made an old man feel happy.
Oh, that's good. By the way, he did not come alone. His wonderful wife, Pamela, is here as well, and she is an absolute jewel. And I hope you'll get a chance to visit with both of them during the reception that's coming. Next question. The war that you survived, was this the Six-Day War in 1967 that you're referencing?
But I have been in Israel almost every war. I missed the Suez War. I didn't come until 1953. But I was there in the 67 war, the 73 war, the 1981-82 war, the first Gaza war, and I am there in spirit now. Our son is a citizen in Israel and is in the reserves.
God bless him. Did you know Kathleen Kenyon?
Yes, I have wonderful stories about Kathleen Kenyon. She didn't like the Israelis. She dug in Jordan. She never came to visit once, but after the 67 war, she came, and she came to Gezer. Well, she was world famous for her expertise in the dirt. So we gave her a polite tour, of all the deep trenches. And at one of the deepest trench, she stopped. She opened her purse, got out her Marshalltown trowel, and jumped down into the square. And she starts slashing away at our balk. Did you not see this trench? And it was astonishing. I took her one day to visit one of her own students who was digging, and she also did the same thing. And she she said, "You fool, you missed this trench." But he knew her habits, and he had on the table a quart of Gordon's gin, and she drank it at lunch, and then we proceeded happily on our way.
It was much easier to put up with after that.
My autobiography is full of stories, if you like stories. There are no stories about me.
We've been blessed to get libraries of a number of people. We've got Eric and Carol Meyer's library, for example. You mentioned them. We also have the library and the papers of Trudy Dotan. Did you know Trudy, and can you tell us about her?
Again, you see, when I saw Trudy Dotan, I heard her voice. I can see her face. I used to spend last night on every trip back to Israel with Trudy. We drank a lot of vodka and told stories. I grew up with that whole generation. Only a few months ago, my oldest and closest friend died, Amnon Ben Tor. I'm the oldest person in the world in this field. I grew up with the first great generation, and the second generation was my own. And I've known the third generation, and Erez Ben Yosef here is the fourth generation. And so I have been there at the beginning. And you know, it's about the stories, about people and who they thought they were. 15 of my old essays are going to be published soon by Society of Biblical Literature. One of those essays goes back 40 years. So I knew almost everybody except Yadin's father. I came 3 years later after his death, but otherwise I have known. And when I pick up a book, I know everybody in the book. I've just written a magnificent, I hope, a history of archaeology, Israeli and American from the beginning. With your help, it's going to be published. And it's full of stories. And no one else has the length and breadth of my experience. 2 years ago, I almost didn't make it. And I wonder if I'm not here as the last spokesman of that generation. And so I'm here.
Well, as someone who comes from a still pretty careful, I hope careful, evangelical background, I want to say thank you very much for giving us your time and giving us your attention and giving us your very good thoughts and very best wishes. And we wish you the very best.
Sir. Oh, I know you do. I know you do. I know you do. Uh-huh.
I had some people come to me and say, you're having him speak, but you don't agree with him on some stuff. And I said, well, I may learn something. And I don't have people in here just to tell me what I already agree with. And no, I have people come in here to tell me what they understand and what they think so I can learn. And I hope that you have a chance to visit with not just Pamela, his wife, but also go ahead and talk to Bill as well. He's a really, really fine gentleman. He said he went to school. Your initial school was
I went to Milligan College.
Milligan College. They played Lipscomb in basketball. We won. The Fighting Bisons of Lipscomb. I want to wish you Godspeed. I wish you the very best. There is a reception. There's food. There's a chance to rub shoulders with the first and second and third and fourth generation. Please give the Devers a chance to get over there before you accost them so that they've got a chance to get over there. And everybody who walks, we have very uneven walkways, so please be careful. God bless you. I hope I see a bunch of you tomorrow. Revelation.